The sweltering August of 1853 descended upon South Carolina's upcountry with a heat that seemed to bake the red clay soil into something approaching brick, while simultaneously making the cotton fields shimmer in ways that created optical illusions suggesting water where none existed. Temperatures climbing to levels that made labor feel like a form of punishment designed specifically to test the limits of human endurance, and that served as a brutal reminder that this was a region where cotton cultivation had transformed landscapes and societies with extraordinary speed over the previous 3 decades. Where the institution of slavery had been expanded and intensified with particular aggression as planters from exhausted coastal rice districts and from other states sought fresh lands and new fortunes. And where the relatively recent establishment of large-scale plantation agriculture meant that the elaborate social conventions and paternalistic pretenses that characterized older slaveholding regions had not yet fully developed. Creating an environment where exploitation could be pursued with fewer constraints and where brutality could be exercised with less concern about community judgment or social consequences. In the slave quarters of Fairmont Plantation, situated in the rolling hills of Greenville District, where the Piedmont began its gradual rise toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, and where the landscape's elevation provided slightly more temperate conditions than the swampy lowlands experienced, but where cotton cultivation nevertheless proceeded with the same relentless intensity that characterized the crop's production throughout the South. Field workers gathered in the evening darkness when temperatures finally dropped to merely oppressive levels, and spoke in voices that carried both profound fascination and considerable anxiety about an extraordinary situation that had been developing over the past 14 months concerning a man whose physical presence was so impossible to conceal, or to make unremarkable that his very existence at Fairmont had created complications that the family who owned the plantation had been struggling with increasing desperation to manage ever since his arrival in June of 1852. According to accounts that were preserved with remarkable consistency in oral histories maintained by descendants of enslaved people who had witnessed events directly and who recognized that what they were observing represented something that exposed fundamental tensions between slaveholders' desire for complete control, over information about their operations, and the physical realities that sometimes made such control simply impossible to maintain, regardless of whatever efforts might be expended. A man named Bakari, who stood 7 feet and 7 inches tall according to measurements that multiple witnesses confirmed with precision, because his extraordinary height had become a subject of constant discussion and speculation throughout the district and beyond, creating a situation where accurate information about his actual size seemed important for distinguishing truth from the exaggerations that inevitably developed around any circumstances that attracted widespread attention and curiosity. Had been purchased in June of 1852 by plantation owner Edmund Whitfield from a Georgia trader under circumstances that suggested the previous owner had been willing to sell someone of such obvious physical capabilities and potential labor value at a price that Whitfield considered remarkably favorable because Bakari's size created complications that apparently outweighed whatever economic benefits his strength might provide for plantation operations that depended on maintaining routines and avoiding disruptions that could interfere with the systematic efficiency that profitable cotton cultivation required. From the moment of Bakari's arrival at Fairmont, Whitfield and his family had apparently recognized that his physical distinctiveness would create challenges that extended far beyond the normal difficulties of managing enslaved workers to involve the fundamental impossibility of keeping his presence unknown to neighbors and to the broader community in ways that slaveholding families throughout the South understood were essential for maintaining control over information about their operations, for managing public perceptions about how enslaved people were treated, and for preventing the kind of specific attention to individual circumstances that might generate curiosity or sympathy, or questions that abstract discussions of slavery as an institution could more easily deflect or dismiss. The complications began almost immediately when neighboring planters visiting Fairmont inevitably encountered Bakari and expressed shocked amazement about someone whose height made him unlike anyone they had ever seen or even heard about in stories. Asking questions about where Whitfield had acquired such an extraordinary worker, and about what capabilities his size provided, and about whether such exceptional physical characteristics came with management difficulties or behavioral peculiarities that might explain why previous owners had been willing to sell him, despite the obvious labor value that his strength represented for heavy agricultural work. Whitfield's responses to these inquiries were apparently evasive and uncomfortable in ways that multiple observers noted, and that created impressions that there existed some situation involving Bakari that Whitfield preferred not to discuss openly. though the specific nature of whatever complications his presence created remained unclear. From the fragmentary and often contradictory information that Whitfield was willing to provide in conversations where outright refusal to answer questions would have violated social conventions governing interactions among South Carolina's planter class even, while complete honesty about concerns regarding Bakari would apparently have revealed information that Whitfield considered problematic, for reasons he chose not to explain to neighbors whose curiosity was understandable, given that encountering someone of such extraordinary size was an experience that naturally prompted questions and discussion. The challenge of concealing Bakari's presence, or even of making it unremarkable, became increasingly apparent as weeks and months passed, and as the sheer impossibility of keeping someone of his size from attracting attention became undeniable to everyone involved. Cotton cultivation required work in fields that were necessarily visible from roads and from neighboring properties. Work that involved dozens of people whose movements and activities could be observed by anyone passing through the area, or by neighbors whose own plantation operations gave them reasons to pay attention to what was occurring at adjacent properties. And Bakari's height made him visible and identifiable from distances where normal-sized workers would have been indistinguishable from one another, or even invisible entirely, due to terrain features or vegetation that provided concealment for people of typical stature, but that Bakari's extraordinary height made completely ineffective as any form of visual barrier. The result was that people traveling through Greenville District on roads that passed near Fairmont would inevitably see someone whose size was so exceptional that they would remember the encounter vividly and would mention it in conversations with others, spreading knowledge about Bakari's presence throughout the upcountry and beyond in ways that Whitfield seemed increasingly frustrated about, but that the fundamental realities of his size and of the work requirements that cotton cultivation imposed made essentially impossible to prevent through any measures short of keeping him confined in ways that would eliminate his economic value, and that would themselves attract attention and generate questions about why someone was being treated so unusually. According to multiple accounts preserved in oral traditions, Whitfield's frustration with his inability to control information about Bakari manifested in various attempts to limit his visibility that created their own complications, and that revealed the fundamental tensions between maximizing economic value through full deployment of Bakari's labor capabilities and minimizing the attention that his presence attracted. Whitfield apparently experimented with assigning Bakari to work in more remote sections of Fairmont's fields, where observation from roads would be less likely. But such assignments created supervision challenges and reduced the efficiency gains that his strength provided because the most remote fields were often also the least productive or the most difficult to work, meaning that the effort to reduce visibility came at the cost of reduced economic returns that Whitfield had presumably purchased Bakari to generate. Whitfield apparently also gave instructions that Bakari should avoid being conspicuous when working near roads or boundaries where observation from outside the plantation was possible. Instructions that were essentially impossible to follow in any meaningful way, given that his size made him conspicuous, regardless of what he did or how he positioned himself, and that attempting to avoid visibility would have required interrupting work constantly whenever anyone approached, creating disruptions that would have eliminated whatever productivity benefits his capabilities provided. The situation became significantly more complicated during the fall and winter of 1852, as stories about the extraordinarily tall man working at Fairmont circulated throughout Greenville District and into neighboring areas, spreading through the networks of communication that connected rural communities, and that made concealing unusual circumstances essentially impossible, despite whatever efforts individuals might make to control information about matters they preferred to keep private. The stories that circulated carried various forms of speculation and interpretation about why Whitfield seemed so concerned about Bakari's visibility. Some people speculated that perhaps Bakari had been involved in violence or serious resistance at previous locations in ways that made Whitfield anxious about his potential danger, but unwilling to dispose of expensive property that generated value when properly managed. Others speculated that perhaps there existed family relationships between Bakari and the Whitfield family that Edmund preferred to keep hidden from public knowledge in patterns that were common throughout the South, where white men's sexual exploitation of enslaved women created children whose paternity was often an open secret that social conventions required not acknowledging directly. Still others speculated that perhaps Bakari's previous enslavement involved legal complications or disputed ownership claims that might expose Whitfield to challenges from other parties who could assert rights that would complicate his control over valuable property. Whatever the actual reasons for Whitfield's evident anxiety about the attention that Bakari attracted, reasons that remained subject to speculation rather than certain knowledge even among those who observed events most closely, and that Whitfield himself never explained in ways that would leave documentary evidence clarifying his motivations beyond his obvious discomfort. With the situation, the complications continued to multiply throughout 1853, as the impossibility of keeping Bakari hidden, or even of making his presence unremarkable, became increasingly undeniable. The attention created various forms of disruption to normal plantation operations that Whitfield found increasingly difficult to manage. Curious travelers would sometimes deliberately route themselves to pass Fairmont, hoping to observe someone whose size had become a subject of widespread discussion. Neighboring planters would visit with ostensible purposes related to normal social or business interactions, but with obvious underlying curiosity about seeing Bakari directly, rather than relying on secondhand descriptions that might have been exaggerated. And people from more distant communities would occasionally appear at Fairmont's boundaries, claiming various reasons for being in the area, but clearly motivated primarily by desire to observe someone whose extraordinary height had become something approaching a local legend throughout the upcountry. Whitfield's responses to this attention apparently alternated between attempting to accommodate curiosity in ways that might satisfy visitors and reduce ongoing interest, and attempting to restrict access to his property in ways that would minimize Bakari's visibility, but that also violated social conventions about hospitality and about planter families' obligations to maintain cordial relationships with neighbors and with the broader community. The inconsistency of these approaches created impressions among many observers that Whitfield's management of the situation was confused and perhaps even irrational, that his anxiety about Bakari's visibility seemed disproportionate to circumstances, and that there must exist some underlying situation that Whitfield was working to conceal, but that his own behavior was paradoxically calling more attention to through the very efforts he was making to minimize visibility and to control information. The situation reached a particularly acute crisis point in the summer of 1853, when a journalist traveling through the upcountry encountered Bakari working in fields visible from a road, and subsequently wrote an article that was published in a Charleston newspaper describing the man of truly extraordinary stature he had observed in Greenville district, and speculating about what circumstances had brought someone so physically distinctive to work on an upcountry cotton plantation. The publication of this article created exactly the kind of widespread attention that Whitfield had been working desperately to prevent. The article was read by thousands of people throughout South Carolina and in neighboring states. It sparked additional newspaper commentary and discussion about Bakari's circumstances in ways that made his presence at Fairmont known to audiences far beyond Greenville district. And it created pressures on Whitfield to respond to inquiries from people who had read the article and who wanted more information about someone whose situation had been described in published writing rather than merely an oral gossip that could be more easily dismissed or controlled. Whitfield's response to the publication revealed the intensity of his frustration, and perhaps also revealed something about the specific nature of his concerns about publicity. According to multiple accounts, he wrote an angry letter to the newspaper demanding a retraction and threatening legal action for what he characterized as an invasion of his privacy and an interference with his property rights, claiming that publishing information about enslaved people on his plantation without his permission constituted a violation that he would not tolerate, and that he would pursue through courts if necessary. The newspaper apparently published portions of Whitfield's letter along with editorial commentary suggesting that slaveholders who reacted with such extreme anger to simple factual reporting about circumstances that were readily observable to anyone passing through public roads were revealing anxieties about aspects of slavery's operations that they preferred to keep hidden from public scrutiny, creating even more attention and discussion that had precisely the opposite effect from what Whitfield's angry response had apparently intended to achieve. The complications continued to escalate during the late summer and fall of 1853, as the attention generated by the newspaper article and by Whitfield's response to it attracted various forms of interest that he found increasingly difficult to manage, and that created pressures from multiple directions. Abolitionists in South Carolina and in other states began discussing Bakari's situation as an example of slavery's operations that deserved investigation and public attention, raising questions about his background and his treatment and about why his owner was so anxious to prevent discussion of circumstances that should have been unremarkable if slavery was indeed the benign institution that its defenders claimed. While defenders of slavery argued that abolitionists were exploiting Bakari's unusual physical characteristics to generate publicity about an individual case that was atypical and that should not be used to make general claims about an institution whose normal operations involved millions of people, whose circumstances bore no relationship to the exceptional situation that one man's extraordinary size had created. The situation also created tensions within Greenville District's planter community, as some slaveholders expressed sympathy for Whitfield's difficulties, while others criticized what they viewed as his mismanagement of a situation that his own behavior had made worse through inconsistent responses that had called more attention to circumstances that might have been less remarkable if he had simply accepted that Bakari's size made him inevitably visible, and had stopped trying to control information in ways that his efforts demonstrated were impossible to achieve. Some planters apparently suggested to Whitfield that the most practical solution would be to sell Bakari to someone in a more remote location where his presence might attract less attention. Though such advice confronted the economic reality that Bakari's labor was generating value that would be difficult to replace, and that selling him would require finding a buyer willing to pay prices reflecting his capabilities, while also accepting the complications that his visibility created. What ultimately happened to Bakari remains somewhat unclear from the fragmentary and sometimes contradictory evidence that survived. Some accounts preserved in oral traditions suggest that Whitfield eventually sold him to a trader who took him to the Deep South, where distance from areas where his story had circulated might provide the obscurity that proximity to Charleston and to newspaper coverage had made impossible. Other accounts suggest that Bakari may have died at Fairmont during the yellow fever epidemic that struck the upcountry in the fall of 1854, and that killed numerous people throughout the region. Still, other accounts hint at possibilities of escape during the period of disruption and increased activity that the attention surrounding his presence had created. Though the absence of clear documentation about his ultimate fate reflects both the general inadequacy of records about enslaved people's lives and the specific incentives that various parties had to maintain silence about a situation that had become so problematic for everyone involved. The broader significance of what occurred at Fairmont during 1852 and 1853 extends beyond the specific details of one man's circumstances to illuminate fundamental aspects of how slavery actually operated, despite the comprehensive control that the system claimed to provide. The story demonstrates that physical realities could sometimes make the control of information that slaveholders considered essential for managing public perceptions and for preventing unwanted scrutiny essentially impossible to maintain regardless of whatever efforts might be expended. That individual characteristics could create situations where maximizing economic value came into direct conflict with minimizing public attention in ways that created dilemmas having no satisfactory resolution. And that the networks of communication connecting communities made concealing unusual circumstances impossible, despite slaveholders' desires to control what information circulated about their operations and about the treatment of people they held as property. The story also reveals how slavery's smooth functioning depended not just on the violence and legal authority that received most attention in discussions of the institution, but also on slaveholders' ability to control information and to manage public perceptions about their operations in ways that prevented the kind of specific attention to individual cases that might generate sympathy or outrage that abstract discussions of slavery as an institution could more easily deflect through ideological justifications and through appeals to economic necessity and social order. When physical realities made such information control impossible, as Bakari's extraordinary height made it impossible for Whitfield to conceal his presence or to prevent public discussion of his circumstances, the resulting complications exposed how dependent slavery's operations were on mechanisms of information management that slaveholders generally took for granted until situations arose that made such management unachievable, despite their best efforts and despite their evident anxiety about the consequences that loss of control over information might create. And sometimes, according to stories that were preserved across generations, by those who had witnessed how one man's physical presence created complications that no amount of effort could resolve and that exposed tensions between slaveholders' desire for both maximum exploitation and complete obscurity. Slavery involved not just the systematic violence and comprehensive legal authority that characterized the institution's formal structures, but also dependencies on information control that physical realities could sometimes make impossible to maintain, creating situations where individual characteristics generated public attention that slaveholders found deeply threatening, because such attention created possibilities for scrutiny and for specific human sympathy. That abstract discussions of slavery could more easily prevent through ideological mystification and through insistence that individual cases were exceptional rather than representative. The man who stood 7 feet 7 inches tall and whose presence at Fairmont during 1852 and 1853 could not be kept hidden, despite the evident anxieties and frustrated efforts of the man who claimed to own him, demonstrated through the complications his size created that slavery's comprehensive control was actually more fragile and more dependent on successful information management than defenders wanted to acknowledge. That individual characteristics could generate attention that no amount of violence or legal authority could prevent when physical realities made concealment impossible. And that the publicity such situations attracted could create exactly the kind of specific human interest and sympathetic curiosity that slavery's defenders generally worked desperately to prevent, because such interests threatened to make abstract ideological justifications about the institution seem inadequate when confronted with concrete knowledge about individual circumstances that made the human costs of slavery's operations undeniable to anyone willing to see what such attention revealed about how the system actually functioned beneath the surface of whatever benign fiction slaveholders maintained in public performances designed to defend an institution whose actual operations required systematic obscurity in order to avoid the scrutiny that detailed. Knowledge about specific cases would inevitably provoke from audiences whose support for or tolerance of slavery might waver if they understood too clearly what the institution involved in practice, rather than in the sanitized abstractions that public discourse generally maintained.